There is always a moment in every major conflict when the nature of the war fundamentally changes. It stops being about gaining ground or defending borders, and instead becomes about whether the system behind the war can survive its own momentum. Most people never recognize when this shift happens. They stay focused on visible indicators: casualty numbers, battlefield updates, political statements. But beneath all of that surface noise, something much deeper begins to break. The foundations that once supported power start to weaken. And right now, we are approaching that exact point. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that it doesn't look dramatic at first. There is no single event that announces it clearly. Life continues to appear normal from the outside. News cycles continue. Markets fluctuate. Governments communicate as if everything is still under control. But internally, the structure is changing. And the reason very few people are prepared for what comes next is simple. This kind of phase has not been experienced directly by anyone alive today. It belongs to history, not memory. To understand what is happening, you need to step away from thinking of this as a simple war update. This is not about tracking daily developments or predicting short-term outcomes. What we are looking at is a pattern, one that has repeated itself across different eras whenever powerful nations reach the final stages of prolonged conflict. It is a phase where systems don't just weaken, they begin to turn inward, consuming their own stability in the process. Every large-scale conflict tends to follow a recognizable trajectory. It begins with confidence, often driven by ideology, strategic ambition, or the belief that the outcome will be quick and decisive. Then comes the middle phase, where reality sets in, progress slows, costs rise. Initial plans are quietly abandoned or adjusted, but the most critical stage is the third phase, the one where the system sustaining the war begins to break under its own weight. This stage is often described in academic terms as overextension, but that label doesn't fully capture what it feels like in reality. From the inside, it appears as a chain of decisions that are no longer driven by clear strategy, but by increasing pressure. Governments start reacting instead of planning. Economies shift heavily towards sustaining the conflict, while everyday civilian life begins to degrade slowly, almost invisibly at first. At the same time, political systems begin to show signs of strain. The gap between what leaders say and what people experience starts to widen. Narratives become harder to maintain, public confidence weakens. Alliances that once seemed stable begin to show cracks, often at the exact moment they are needed the most, and history shows that during this phase there is almost always one major miscalculation, one decision that triggers consequences far beyond what was intended. The real concern is not whether this pattern exists, it clearly does. The real concern is whether the global system today is prepared to handle the consequences when this phase fully unfolds. Because this stage behaves very differently from everything that comes before it. In earlier phases, countries still operate from a position of strength. They rely on reserves, financial, military, and social, that were built over long periods of stability. But those reserves are not endless. Over time, they begin to erode, and eventually, the conflict is no longer sustained by surplus resources, but by deficit. This shift changes everything. When a system moves from surplus to deficit, the nature of decision-making transforms completely. Choices become more constrained, trade-offs become more severe, and every action carries deeper consequences. Fighting a conflict under deficit conditions forces governments to make difficult adjustments. They must draw from parts of society that were never meant to be mobilized. Industries that once supported civilian life are redirected toward war production. Financial systems are stretched through borrowing or monetary expansion, and alliances are formed under pressure, often with partners who demand significant concessions in return. Each of these decisions introduces new vulnerabilities, and in this phase, those vulnerabilities do not exist in isolation. They begin to overlap and reinforce each other. Financial strain affects political stability. Industrial limitations affect military capability. Social pressure influences strategic decisions. The system becomes interconnected in ways that amplify risk rather than absorb it. This is where the situation becomes particularly fragile, because when multiple pressures peak at the same time, the system loses its ability to respond smoothly. Instead of controlled adjustments, it starts experiencing reactive shifts, and these shifts are rarely predictable. They are shaped by urgency, not long-term thinking. From the outside, this doesn't look like collapse. It looks like normal activity with underlying tension. Policies are still being announced. Operations are still being carried out. But internally, the margin for error is shrinking, and when that margin becomes too small, even minor disruptions can trigger disproportionately large consequences. This is why understanding this phase matters, because without recognizing it, everything appears random, just another series of events in a complex world. But once you see the structure behind it, a pattern begins to emerge, and that pattern reveals something important. This is not a stable moment. it is a transition, and transitions are where the greatest risks exist. When a conflict reaches this advanced stage, the most visible pressure point is often financial, but what makes it dangerous is the scale at which that pressure builds. Modern warfare is not just expensive. It operates at a level of cost that stretches entire national economies. We are talking about sustained expenditure that goes beyond defense budgets and begins to affect the overall economic structure of a country. And when that kind of pressure continues for long enough, it forces decisions that ripple far beyond the battlefield. The reality is that high-intensity conflict today consumes resources at a speed that few systems are designed to handle. Advanced weapons systems, precision munitions, defensive technologies, all of them require massive investment. And once deployed, they are used at a rate that quickly outpaces production. What took years to build can be depleted in months. This creates a widening gap between what is needed and what can realistically be replaced. At the same time, the countries funding these operations are not operating from perfect financial conditions. Many of them are already dealing with existing economic strain post-crisis, debt, inflationary pressure, aging populations, and infrastructure demands. So when the cost of conflict is layered on top of these existing challenges, the system begins to feel pressure from multiple directions at once, and this is where difficult choices start to emerge. Governments are forced into trade-offs that have no clean solutions. Reducing domestic spending to sustain the conflict can create dissatisfaction and instability at home. Increasing borrowing may delay immediate consequences, but it builds long-term financial risk. Expanding the money supply might seem like a short-term fix, but it introduces inflation that directly affects everyday life. Each option shifts the burden to a different part of the system, but none of them remove it. And that is the key dynamic here. The pressure does not disappear, it moves. It transfers from one sector to another, from governments to citizens, from present stability to future uncertainty. And over time, these transfers begin to accumulate. The system becomes less flexible, less resilient, and more sensitive to disruption. Now layer on the industrial dimension, and the situation becomes even more complex. The production systems that support modern defense capabilities were not built for prolonged, high-intensity conflict. They were designed for efficiency, not for sustained output under pressure. In many cases, production lines were optimized for peacetime replenishment, not wartime consumption at scale. This creates a structural mismatch. The demand generated by conflict continues to rise, but the capacity to meet that demand cannot expand at the same pace. Building new facilities, retraining specialized labor, securing supply chains, all of this takes time. And time is exactly what high-intensity conflict does not provide. So the gap between production and consumption doesn't just remain, it grows. This gap is not just a logistical issue. It represents a deeper vulnerability in the system. Because when a country cannot sustain its own operational needs, it becomes dependent on external support, alternative sourcing, or strategic compromise. And each of those paths introduces new risks: political, economic, and strategic. But the most critical layer of this entire phase is not financial or industrial, it is social and political. Because this is where systems either adapt or begin to fracture. Prolonged conflict changes populations. It alters priorities. It reshapes expectations. And over time, it creates a disconnect between what is being asked of people and what they are willing to sustain. Economic pressure begins to affect daily life. Costs rise. Stability feels less certain. And when that pressure is not evenly distributed, it creates imbalance. Some groups feel the strain more than others, and that imbalance slowly erodes the sense of shared purpose that is often necessary to sustain long-term commitment. At the same time, the information environment becomes increasingly saturated. People are exposed to constant updates, constant narratives, constant interpretations of what is happening. And over time, this can lead to two very different outcomes. In some cases, it strengthens resolve, but more often, it leads to fatigue, a gradual sense of exhaustion that reduces engagement and weakens support. In open political systems, this effect becomes even more pronounced. Because decisions are not made in isolation, they are influenced by public opinion, electoral cycles, and political competition. Leaders must constantly balance strategic objectives with domestic realities, and as pressure builds, that balance becomes harder to maintain. This is where another critical shift begins to take shape. When original goals become too costly or too distant to achieve, they are often redefined, not abandoned but adjusted. And this adjustment is one of the most sensitive moments in any conflict, because it forces leaders to navigate between perception and reality. Accepting a reduced outcome can be interpreted as weakness, but escalating in an attempt to regain momentum introduces new risks. And history shows that this is often the point where systems make their most consequential decisions not out of confidence but out of pressure. Sometimes escalation produces short-term gains, but triggers a stronger response that brings the situation back to equilibrium at a higher level of tension. Sometimes it fails completely, leading to internal instability, and in some cases, it creates consequences that expand the conflict beyond its original scope. This is what makes this phase so unpredictable. It is not defined by a single path, but by a range of possible outcomes all shaped by decisions made under pressure, with incomplete information and limited time. And when you step back and look at all of these layers together, financial strain, industrial limits, political fatigue, you begin to see the full picture. These are not separate issues. They are interconnected forces that reinforce each other. And when they all peak at the same time, the system reaches a point where stability becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. This is not collapse, but it is instability at a structural level. And in that kind of environment, even small decisions can have outsized consequences. When a system reaches this level of pressure, the greatest risk is no longer gradual decline, it is sudden escalation. Not necessarily because anyone intends it, but because the environment itself becomes unstable. Decisions are made faster, margins for error shrink, and in that kind of setting, even actions that seem controlled can produce outcomes that quickly move beyond anyone's expectations. What makes this phase particularly dangerous is that escalation rarely appears as a single deliberate step. It unfolds through a chain of reactions. One move triggers another, a response leads to a counter-response, and each side interprets its actions as necessary, even defensive. But when viewed from a broader perspective, the trajectory becomes clear. It is moving toward a level of conflict that is fundamentally different from what existed before. This is how major shifts in history have often occurred, not through one decisive moment, but through a series of interconnected decisions, each one justified in isolation, each one shaped by immediate pressure. But together, they form a path that no single actor originally intended to create, and once that path is established, reversing it becomes increasingly difficult. One of the most critical aspects of this phase is miscalculation. When systems are under stress, the ability to accurately interpret signals begins to weaken. Actions are misunderstood, intentions are misread, and responses are based on assumptions that may not reflect reality. In a stable environment, there is time to verify, to communicate, to adjust, but in a high-pressure environment, that time disappears. This is what creates the risk of cascading escalation, a situation where the conflict does not expand because of a single strategic decision, but because of a series of obligations, reactions, and perceived necessities. Each step feels justified in the moment, but collectively, they push the system toward a level of confrontation that becomes increasingly difficult to control. Now layer in the most sensitive dimension of all strategic deterrence. In a world where multiple states possess advanced capabilities, including nuclear systems, the stakes of miscalculation increase dramatically. The presence of these capabilities does not automatically lead to their use. In fact, their primary role is to prevent escalation, but under certain conditions, the logic that governs their restraint can begin to shift. This does not happen suddenly. It happens when pressure builds across multiple dimensions at once. Military pressure, political instability, internal divisions, and a growing sense that the current trajectory may lead to outcomes that threaten core interests. In that kind of environment, the threshold for what is considered acceptable risk can begin to change. The danger is not a single intentional decision to escalate beyond control. The danger is the gradual erosion of the systems that prevent such decisions from ever becoming necessary. Communication channels weaken, trust declines, clarity disappears. And when those safeguards are reduced, the system becomes more vulnerable to unintended outcomes. What makes the current moment even more complex is that the mechanisms designed to manage these risks are not as strong as they once were. In previous eras, there were structured frameworks that allowed opposing sides to communicate clearly, even during periods of high tension. There were established protocols, agreements, and shared understandings that helped reduce uncertainty. Today, many of those mechanisms have weakened. Communication is less direct, trust is more limited, and the shared understanding of boundaries is less defined. This does not mean that escalation is inevitable, but it does mean that managing risk has become more difficult. And when risk becomes harder to manage, the consequences of error increase. At the same time, technological change is accelerating the pace of this entire process. New forms of warfare, automated systems, rapid response capabilities, advanced targeting are compressing decision timelines. What once took hours or days to assess may now require decisions in minutes. And when decisions are made faster, the margin for careful judgment becomes smaller. This creates an environment where the system is not just under pressure, it is under time pressure, and time pressure amplifies every other risk. It reduces the ability to pause, to evaluate, to reconsider. and in doing so, it increases the likelihood that decisions will be made based on incomplete information or immediate necessity. Now step back and look at the broader global impact of this phase, because this is not limited to the actors directly involved in the conflict. The effects extend outward into economic systems, political structures, and global stability. Defense spending rises across multiple regions, resources are redirected, priorities shift, and the balance between civilian and strategic investment begins to change. This has long-term consequences. Economic growth can slow, public services can come under pressure, inequality can increase, and global cooperation becomes more difficult to sustain. Because when multiple systems are under stress at the same time, coordination becomes more complex, and without coordination, managing large-scale challenges becomes significantly harder. At the same time, global supply chains remain sensitive to disruption. Trade patterns adjust, strategic dependencies are reassessed, and countries begin to prioritize resilience over efficiency. This transition may strengthen systems in the long term, but in the short term, it introduces friction, costs increase, adjustments take time, and uncertainty remains elevated. Political systems also feel this pressure. Public expectations shift, trust becomes more fragile, and leadership decisions are scrutinized more closely. In this kind of environment, maintaining stability requires not just effective policy but clear communication and consistent direction. And when those elements are missing, the risk of internal instability increases. So what we are looking at is not just a conflict, it is a moment of systemic stress, a point where multiple layers of the global system are being tested at the same time: financial systems, industrial capacity, political stability, strategic balance, all interacting, all influencing each other. And this brings us to the most important realization. The outcome of this phase is not predetermined. There is no single path that must be followed. History shows that different outcomes are possible. Some systems manage to stabilize, they adapt, they find ways to reduce pressure and create new forms of balance. Others fail to do so, and the result is a period of prolonged instability that reshapes the global order. What determines the outcome is not just the conditions, it is the decisions made within those conditions. Decisions made under pressure, decisions made with limited time, decisions made by a small number of individuals whose choices will have consequences far beyond their immediate context. Right now, we are in the part of the process where both outcomes are still possible. The system has not reached a point of no return, but the window for shaping that outcome is not unlimited, and that is why this moment matters. Because while most people are still focused on surface-level events, the deeper transformation is already underway. The structure behind those events is shifting, and once that shift reaches a certain point, it becomes much harder to reverse. Understanding this does not change the situation, but it changes how you see it. Instead of reacting to isolated developments, you begin to recognize patterns, you begin to see connections, and you begin to understand that what appears complex on the surface often follows a deeper logic underneath. And in a world where uncertainty is increasing, that understanding becomes one of the most valuable tools you can have, because the real risk is not just what happens next, it's not seeing it coming.